Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras. Today I'm talking to Paul Shrimpton about the educational philosophy of Blessed John Henry Newman. Hi everyone, just wanted to remind you that at CatholicCulture.org we're currently doing our Fall Challenge campaign. It features a challenge grant of $60,000 offered by our CatholicCulture.org boosters. And between now and the beginning of Advent, December 2nd, every new donation up to $60,000 will be matched. So now is a great time to make your gift count. Just go to CatholicCulture.org/donate. Today's episode is about a very important English Catholic figure who I think will probably be named a Doctor of the Church someday, Blessed John Henry Newman. My guest is Dr. Paul Shrimpton. Who has taught at Magdalen College School, Oxford, since 1981. He has spent nearly 3 decades researching the educational ideas and practice of John Henry Newman. And besides various papers and chapters, he has published 3 books: A Catholic Eton, Newman's Oratory School, which was a study of the foundation and early life of the first Catholic public school in England; The Making of Men, the Idea and Reality of Newman's University in Oxford and Dublin; and most recently, Conscience Before Conformity, Hans and Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Resistance in Nazi Germany, a study of the cultural and religious background of the White Rose students, which brings out the influence of Newman. He's currently working on a critical edition of Newman's University papers, which were published posthumously in 1896. Paul Shrimpton, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thank you.
So we're here to talk about John Henry Newman, Blessed John Henry Newman, and his work in the field of education, and particularly with reference to his well-known book, The Idea of a University. Maybe we could start, if you don't mind, by just getting an overview of what his involvement in education was throughout his life, and both practically and theoretically.
Right. Perhaps I can first of all start with my involvement in this, which was about 30 years ago, when I began to research on his founding of a school in England, the first of its type. That led on to me for a doctorate and then a first book on Newman. And then I applied the same sort of techniques as an historian of education to his work at the university, first at Oxford, reforming it, and then later setting up a Catholic university in Dublin in 1854. Newman, of course, is, as you said, is very well known for his book, The Idea of University. It's probably the leading thing about him, which connects him with education, but it's not all he did. I'd almost say the whole of his life was spent in education, first on the receiving end, and then delivering, you could say, but involved in coordinating people, but on a large scale in terms of setting up a school, setting up a university, reforming Oxford, down to the very one-to-one level of dealing with individuals in letters or in person, even helping his younger sisters, the 3 of them, with their education when their father had died, and his 2 younger brothers as well. So really from the age of more or less 15 to when he was 89, Newman was involved in education. And it isn't just in his major works like The Idea that his vision comes through, but actually it's everywhere. It's right throughout these, 25,000 letters we're left with, as well as the 2 novels, in his sermons, and in his, many, many letters.
So what was the occasion on which he wrote this book?
Well, he was responding to the invitation by Archbishop Paul Cullen in Ireland in 1851, first of all, to advise him about founding a university. He was asked to give, I suppose, material advice, but in particular, names of people, of converts, who could help. There is quite a long backstory, which I can perhaps begin, if that's okay now.
Sure.
Which is to say, effectively, that this is the only lengthy thing I've really got to say, which is if you go right back to the founding of Trinity College Dublin in 1592, that was, founded for Protestant Irishmen. And up to the time of Newman in the 1850s, there were no alternatives for Catholics. Admittedly, at the end of the 18th century, Trinity did relax its entry requirements to allow Catholics to come in, but the whole place was steeped in Protestantism that really it wasn't possible for the Catholics to survive there. In the 1840s, in 1845 in particular, the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, set up what's known as the Queen's Colleges in 3 Irish cities of Belfast, Cork and Galway. And these were based on the principle of mixed education. They were secular or non-denomination universities, and it sort of divided the Irish hierarchy completely. A slight majority favoured somehow working with them, if possible, with the idea that they could get something better later on, but Rome was telling them not to involve themselves, and repeatedly letters were coming across to the Irish hierarchy encouraging them to set up a Catholic university of their own, along the lines of the one at Louvain in Belgium in 1834. And not long after Paul Cunnan had been appointed Archbishop, he called a synod in Ireland at Thurles in August 1850, and by narrow margins the bishops voted unanimously actually, to set up the Catholic University, but narrowly, so that it would withhold themselves from any involvement in the Queen's colleges, and that they would warn the laity strongly from attending them. So once that had happened, Cullen asked Newman for advice, and he wrote, and I'll quote his words, "If you could spare time to give us a few lectures in education, you'd be rendering service to religion in Ireland." Newman accepted that first invitation, then the second one, which came 3 months later from Cullen, which was actually to be the founding rector. So there he was, faced with the problem in 1851 and 52, how to go about speaking to the Irish people and laying the ground for university. Firstly, he had to fill out the idea of what a university was and explain what he meant by words like education and university, because he didn't feel that they meant the same to Irishmen as they did to Englishmen. So in fact, many Irishmen probably had the idea that a university was simply not much more than, well, what we would call here a super secondary school, what you would say a super high school. It wasn't much more than that. He decided in the end to start off by using the example of Oxford, even though this was in the decade after the Great Famine, and there was a lot of Irish anti-English feeling in Ireland. So his idea was to pitch his offer firstly to the influential constituency which hankered after Trinity College in Dublin. This was to the likes of the Dublin barristers and their friends, and he did so by reasoned argument, appealing to English precedent rather than on strictly Catholic grounds or call of duty. Then he had, so really he was saying, I can match Trinity College Dublin and Oxford, and I'll do something which is Catholic to boot. So he then had to try and get on side the Irish hierarchy themselves, who were deeply split in the ways in which they reacted to British education policy. Some wanted to go along with the mixed education schools first and then the Queen's colleges, but others wanted to follow Rome fully. So Newman had to try and balance these two, and he really did it by, when he was talking about theology, saying, yes, this would have to form a central part, but it would be in the context of a university being a home of learning for its own sake. So in other words, he got both sides together by sort of going in that direction, by appealing to the context of Oxford and Trinity to get the laity on side, and then to satisfy the clergy that theology was going to be there right at the centre, or as a fully fledged subject like all the other ones.
Perhaps we could go back and you could talk a little bit about why it was that Rome would not have wanted Catholics in Ireland to get involved with these non-denominational schools, because that might seem like a foreign attitude today to many. At least our hierarchy seems much less concerned about such things.
Sure, yes. I'd find it difficult to actually articulate the mindset from Rome. I certainly articulate Newman's thinking on this. I mean, he came from Oxford. It was a creedal university, Anglican, but he deeply felt that by being Anglican, it would affect everything that went on in it. Nothing was untouched by that. So he would have gone to morning and evening prayers every day while being an undergraduate. And even though Oxford wasn't in very good shape when he was there, in the 1810s. Nevertheless, there was something whole about it. It all fitted together. It was of a piece. And he felt that as soon as you take away theology, what you're offering begins to disintegrate. It doesn't form a whole anymore. So he didn't need any convincing about this.
So it might be like, in a sense, we have many colleges that, rather than offering theology, they have departments of what is called religious studies. So non-denominational university at that time, I suppose, and correct me if I'm wrong, might have offered a sort of religious indifferentism in the intellectual life.
The first in English-speaking world to actually eliminate theology was University College London, starting in about 1828. It was really to allow the dissenters, those Protestants who weren't Anglicans, to have something to be able to partake in higher education. So it was somehow to put the problem in inverted commas of religion to one side that this was done. But for the likes of Newman, this education for him, you see, was something deeply religious. You could not separate it out. I know in somewhere like the United States, this is very commonly done, and everyone just takes it for granted nowadays. But if Newman were around today, he would be very strong in saying, no, there is something seriously deficient about this. You might be doing something very good, but there's something so much better that could be done if religion informed every aspect of it.
Okay, so that leads us to our first topic in terms of the arguments that Newman is making in this book. Why do you think he begins with the question of theology rather than defining what a liberal education is from the very beginning?
Well, because he had been asked to be the founding rector of this new university, invited by the Irish bishops, who'd in turn been asked by Rome to do precisely this. So on the one hand, certainly, yes, he's responding to a request from the successor of Peter. So he's fully on board as far as that. For him, it makes total sense. What he has to do is to win over the doubters among the bishops in the first place, also among the laity. I don't think the laity doubted so much the idea of having theology at university. What they were scared of was that the bishops weren't really interested in a university, but just wanted somehow a lay seminary or a finishing school preparing people for the professions or for work itself in a very practical fashion. They really doubted whether they were that keen on a university, properly speaking. After all, they'd never been a university in Ireland apart from Trinity College Dublin, which was Protestant, and all the Irish hierarchy had been educated in seminaries. None of them had been to what most people would call a university.
Yeah, it's also interesting because, of course, the attitude towards lay people being involved in theology at all at that time was very different. So he starts out by arguing for the necessity of theology in any institution calling itself a university, and he takes it for granted that a university, by definition, is something that deals with every branch of knowledge. Can you explain his argument there?
Yes. So it's a very simple one. I mean, he said that the major subjects should all be there. Theology is one of them. And if you take this crucial subject out, you'll dislocate the whole system. It is something essential there for the circle of knowledge, as he would call it. So he's doing this. It's a plea for true intellectual culture in which he wants all the major subjects there, because his conception is that there'll be jostling for position and things will settle down and subjects won't start encroaching over the territory of other ones if all the main players are there.
So he talks a bit about the dangers of compartmentalization in knowledge, and as you just alluded to, the interrelation between each of the sciences. He argues specifically that no one science is capable of defining its own boundaries. So why is that for him?
Well, it's a matter of, doesn't quite say this, but I'm paraphrasing now. It's all about first principles. A subject can't, hopefully people will agree on what they are, but they can't referee their own subject. You need something else to do that. Now, some people think Newman meant theology was to be the referee, but it's not. He uses the words, it's philosophy to get close to it, but it's got to be something which binds all the subjects together and indicates where one is trespassing, has gone too far, is overstepping its reach, is now engaging in a subject area of which it isn't capable of arriving at the truth. So he says really that every subject has its own methods, its own assumptions, its own working tools, its own mental disposition, you could say, and that enables it to do its work. So theology has its own presuppositions, its axioms, which are not those of other subjects. So it's a bit like a jigsaw. There are lots of pieces to go there, but one piece is not another. Newman did very much think that part of the reason for going to university and seeing all the major subjects was that every student would have an overview of the whole landscape of knowledge and see how the particular piece that he or she was studying would fit into the whole.
One of the interesting points that he makes there is that it's not just a matter of different disciplines covering different areas, because it's more like different disciplines study the same things in different respects or from different perspectives. So he talks about how even, for example, we take it for granted, for example, that a discipline like mathematics is abstract and does not really tell us about the world that we experience without being combined with some other sciences. But he makes the point that even this is actually true in a sense of every discipline, of every science. So, for example, chemistry only tells us about the physical world in one respect.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not combined with physics and all these other things, it's not going to give us the real thing unless they're all integrated and applied. So likewise, it's not so much that theology would be encroaching on another science or that it would be completing other sciences in the sense of sort of telling them what their job is, but that since theology is the subject matter of theology is a part of reality, the other sciences just are not going to be able to look at reality from that perspective. So theology is necessary. And also, well, he points out essentially that human beings by nature are loath to remain uncertain on the points that they're studying. They hate not being able to come to a conclusion on something, and that they would almost rather come to a hasty or imperfect conclusion than have to abstain from coming to a conclusion at all. And that's one reason that he gives for this phenomenon that we have of when one of the sciences is missing, whether it's theology or one of the secular sciences, the other sciences almost inevitably come to expand and distort themselves in an effort to fill the role that they feel is missing because of that other science not being there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he does this in quite an extended passage in one place where he says, imagine that somebody decides to set up a university in which the agency of man can be denied. And he sets up the whole thing saying, yes, they've got a prospectus going, they've got exams, they appoint professors, and then he says, well, they may end up saying that psychology itself has to be denied. It's really a reductio ad absurdum, pointing out that once you do something like that, you end up with something which is just nonsensical. It's absurd. And he did that in order to point out the absurdity of omitting theology.
And it's interesting because he also, points out that it's not just going to be detrimental to theology if other sciences try to take its place. It's detrimental to those sciences itself. Do you think you could give an example of how a science might disadvantage itself by attempting to stretch in that way?
One of his colleagues at Oriel College, Oxford, was an economist called Nassau Senior, and the British government during the 1840s, when the Irish potato famine was raging, took what he had said and put it into effect, which was, he was really arguing that the government should not interfere and that the population should adjust itself to a natural level. Now, he didn't really see what was happening to what he'd written, but this is an example of just taking economics by itself and letting it work its way out. And it turned out, of course, that millions of Irishmen either died or had to emigrate. But the British government's policy on that was looking at one subject matter only, which was this up-and-coming subject, economics. So, I mean, it had catastrophic effects. I tend to think economists are guilty of this quite a lot because you can have, say, economics for breakfast, lunch, dinner. You can read The Economist. You can just talk with economists and end up reducing the world. It is a type of reductionism to just your one subject area and trying to solve the world's problems by means of that. Scientists are in danger of doing that. Mathematicians too, and computer scientists. It is all around us. So what Newman here has to say is wonderful. He talks about the importance for everyone to have some sort of joined up thinking in which they know not just their own subject, but to know what they don't know in other subjects, but know enough to know that they can also supply answers.
Okay, so that leads us to the topic of a liberal education. So for Newman, the second argument that he's making in this book is that, as you mentioned, knowledge is to be sought for its own sake. Not that it doesn't have uses beyond itself, not that it doesn't have value beyond itself. And we have to understand exactly what he means by knowledge when he's saying that, because not just any kind of knowledge is worth pursuing for its own sake. But I guess maybe we can start by talking about what he means by liberal knowledge.
Well, he really means knowledge which isn't going to be necessarily immediately applicable to some profession or whatever. He's more interested actually in many ways in the knower rather than the knowledge. What he thinks is ideal for university education is the type of knowledge which stretches and exercises the mind as much as possible. And at the time, I suppose that what enabled mental culture to take place and to be fostered was the classics. Although I think if Newman were around nowadays, he would see that the sciences, other disciplines for that matter, can do this as well. And I should have mentioned mathematics as well as classics. But what makes it liberal is the purpose for which that knowledge is put. So he uses the extraordinary example of theology itself. And he says it can be taught as a liberal art if you go to university to study it, maybe with the end view of going to work in, say, finance or the law. But if, in fact, you're entering a seminary and you are studying theology to be ordained, then it's not a liberal education necessarily. It's a training for a particular profession, a very special profession, that of the priesthood.
Okay, very interesting. So it's more a matter of the use to or lack thereof to which it's going to be put than its importance even.
Yes, exactly, yes. So he somehow appears to be neglecting the value of culture itself when he's talking about this. But it's developing all sorts of attributes of the human mind. So it's not being trained to do anything in particular, but it's just being trained in general. This might sound a bit highfalutin, a bit abstract, but he claims, and I think many people would agree with him, that mental health which is developed enables a person to apply themselves to any discipline whatsoever, if it is a thorough and a good and deep education which they're having.
Yeah, I remember he uses the analogy of physical health insofar as he says that ultra specialization may be good for society in the short term, but it's not good for the person who is overly specialized. And he uses the analogy of, someone who is physically trained only for a particular task. That is not necessarily healthy to overdevelop one part of the body at the expense of the others. But he says that, if you are just aiming for general overall physical health, that may not prepare you directly for this or that physical task, but it makes you more able to quickly and harmlessly learn any given physical task. And so with the mental life as well.
Exactly. That's it. Yes. The former Prime Minister of Britain, Harold Macmillan, once quipped that when he studied classics at Oxford, he came away with very little knowledge in one sense, but that the main point of his education was being able to detect when a man is talking rot or not. And he said that is the sole purpose of education. So you could come away with virtually nothing in your head in terms factual wise. But if you're able to untangle arguments, to make judgments in any discipline, then that would be time well worth spent.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've talked about what liberal means and liberal knowledge. When he talks about knowledge in general, in the highest sense, in the sense that is pursued at the university, he seems to equate it with philosophy. So when he's talking about, he uses the word philosophy, he's not just talking about the discipline of philosophy, but I think he's trying to get at the quality of true knowledge being of a philosophical kind. So what kind of knowledge specifically is he saying is worth pursuing for its own sake? Is it just facts? Is it information? Is it a set of propositions?
It's that, and it's much more. I mean, again, let me just tilt it in another direction. He's interested in how the mind reacts to that knowledge, how it absorbs it into the human mind, systematizes it, puts it into all sorts of categories, how it argues with it. So it digests it. That's one metaphor he uses quite a lot. But like all that Newman writes, it's very difficult to paraphrase, because he takes a picture from one angle, he moves around, looks at it from another perspective, then a third one, then a fourth, and gradually fills out. So he's all the time developing these things. So it's like developing a theme, and this theme is university education. So he's working out what it is from all these different angles. So he rattles off whole categories of different things which the mind can engage in. So here's an example. To open the mind, to correct it, to refine it, to enable it to know, to digest, to master, to rule, to use its knowledge, to give it power over its own faculties, application, flexibility, method, critical exactness, sagacity, resource, address, eloquent expression, is an object as intelligent as the cultivation of virtue, while at the same time being absolutely distinct from it. So when Newman explains things, he normally gives a whole category. It's very difficult to sort of, unless you sort of parrot learn these, to sort of to wrap it up in one go.
I seem to remember that I think maybe he was quoting another English writer on this, that he said, this writer had said, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact words, but the man who has a true education is the master of the knowledge of other men, but the man who is not educated is not even the master of what he does know.
That sounds very good. It's not something I've heard before. So I'm not sure where you've seen that.
But it sounds like, anyway, one of the phrases he uses for the purpose of education is the formation of judgment. So it's not about any given sort of piece of knowledge so much as it is the ability to put knowledge in its proper place and to use it profitably.
Yes. I mean, he would say that a liberal education schools the mind in how to make judgments, and this makes a person better fitted to take any role. So it's not applied to any particular role, but it's all roles in general, yes. Alistair MacIntyre says something similar to that. So liberal knowledge transforms us as human beings. It makes us what we ought to be and need to be if we are to be good human beings. And Alistair MacIntyre is very much following in Newman's tracks in this. And we know that from one of his latest books, which was written about 7 or 8 years ago.
So Newman makes an argument that I found pretty provocative, and I think many people in the field of Catholic education would find provocative. I mean, many of the Catholic colleges in the United States, I mean, the seriously Catholic colleges, put a high emphasis in their marketing materials on the moral formation, the formation in faith, which the students receive there, which of course is a good thing. But Newman phrases a possible objection to his position on liberal knowledge, which is sort of as follows. If the end of liberal knowledge isn't useful, then it has to be moral or religious. But the philosophers, the gentlemen, the educated men haven't lived according to the high ideas that they talked about. They haven't seemed to make people better, whereas at least the people who are advocating knowledge for utility, though they picked a lower goal, have continually delivered on that promise. And Newman surprisingly acknowledges this, and he says, yes, that's right, but the end of liberal knowledge is not to make people virtuous.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sort of curious about how he would defend that claim while still showing that the health of the mind is a worthy pursuit in itself.
Yes, his book is about the idea of university, not an idea of a Catholic university. So it's really dealing with the university in its essence, which is passing on knowledge, transmitting knowledge, forming the human mind. In one letter, he refers to his 3 works on education, 2 of them being the first and second half of the idea. The third one is rarely mentioned. It's a collection of 20 historical essays, which was published finally in volume 3 of historical sketches. And that really is the outline of his pastoral view of university education. And that's missing from the idea. So in this third volume, he speaks about the fullness of education, and it's there that the pastoral side gets full treatment. What I think he was afraid of in Dublin was the bishops being so keen on the Catholic side that it would somehow suppress or distort the inner nature of education itself. And this is what the lay people were somehow afraid of. So he had to defend the essence of university. But that didn't mean he didn't appreciate and want that thoroughgoing training in virtue to be there as well. But you see, it's one of the things which doesn't really enter into the idea of university, and which does enter into this volume of historical sketches, is the way he views. I'm going to talk here about, say, the university and the college in the Oxford sense, so that people belong to a college which is within something greater, the university itself, using the word in the English sense, that is college. He saw the university as giving, say, teaching faith, but the college as nurturing faith on an individual level. So what he wanted in Dublin was, yes, for theologians to address the whole university one and the same time, but each collegiate house, these residences or dorms, as you would call them, had their own individual chapels. Each one had its own chaplain and confessor, and it's there that the individual faith of a student would be nurtured, and the two somehow work together. So the essence of a university to him was the lecturers, the professors, but for the fullness, you had to have residential places, if possible, where faith was nurtured in a sort of family-like setting. So he wanted these places to be a home from home, a second home, and borrow something off the nature of the original home people had come from.
I see. Okay. So, yeah, that makes sense. So he's leaving a place for faith in there, even though that's not part of the definition of a university per se.
In its strict sense, yes.
I'm still sort of curious about this idea that the end of philosophy is not to make one virtuous, because, the ancients certainly talked about philosophy as much as a way of life, as an intellectual pursuit. And is he just basically dismissing that and saying that that ultimately came to nothing? Or because, the classical definition, the etymological definition of philosophy is the love of wisdom. And certainly Newman would say that wisdom bears on one's conduct, but it seems that he thinks that philosophy doesn't.
Yes, but it really depends whether you're talking at the natural level or the supernatural level. He flips quite often to and fro in the idea and elsewhere, from talking about natural man to talking about man with grace coming in. He did, yes, like many people, reach the conclusion that knowledge at the natural level only goes so far, that the university, in theory, could reach the truth, but in practice, it can't. And it needs the help of grace, it needs the help of the church. But he saw this working not so much the university itself as through all the ancillary things, but above all through the collegiate foundations. So it's not always easy to know what precisely Newman is talking about at any one moment. And you obviously have people who are very well versed in philosophy and know what is right, but then not do what is right. So something extra is required. One thing is the intellect, another thing completely is the will. And it's really the will and those other strengths which nurtured from the pastoral point of view. And that wasn't something Newman dealt with, in particular, in the idea itself.
Right. I guess what I'm wondering is that, Aristotle wrote his Ethics. I think it's safe to say that he wrote it not just for the goal of people knowing about virtue, but also for people being able to put those things into practice and actually become virtuous.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is, let's say if somebody was very well versed in all that and had a deep understanding of that and yet didn't practice it, would Newman say they're a bad philosopher because a good philosopher is not just one who knows, but one who lives? Or is he saying, well, the living part is just completely separate from philosophy itself?
That's a very difficult question in a way. Newman did teach with the Nicomachean ethics in the 1920s and 30s, early 30s. So he'd been through them many times with his students, and it was something right at the heart of the Tractarians and the way they thought. But you see, they felt there's something deep inside us, which is like a sort of openness to the truth, an ethos, they called it actually, which enabled people not just to absorb the theory, but to put that into practice. I suppose they said that ethics is just something so incredibly delicate. Studying is not enough. There needs to be a very refined disposition to this teaching in order for those things to work themselves out, in effect. And this is aided by grace. It can happen at the natural level with virtuous individuals, with your virtuous pagan, but it can happen in a much more accelerated way, obviously, when grace is around.
So perhaps this brings us to something he discusses at the end of, well, we're mainly, I should say, not the end of the idea of the university, because at least the edition I have is divided into two parts. He's got this sort of unified set of lectures, and then he's got these lectures on miscellaneous topics to do with the university. But I'm speaking about the end of the first part, where he talks about the difference between what he calls philosophical culture, or the religion of reason, and Christianity. So what exactly is the religion of reason, or the culture of a gentleman, which he talks about?
Well, at the time when people in Victorian England were certainly moving away from religion, Matthew Arnold might be a key one. Effectively, these people, they thought that they could replace religion with culture. I think that's what you're alluding to. So it appears to meet many of the requirements for education, but as far as Newman is concerned, it falls short. He does paint this extraordinary picture of the gentleman like no one else has ever done, but at the very end of it, he almost smashes it to pieces, saying, this only goes so far, but it doesn't make the Christian. So he says, liberal education makes not the Christian, not the Catholic, but the gentleman. So it's a fine thing from its own point of view, but it doesn't even begin to reach what Christianity can reach.
One of the you mentioned him smashing it into pieces. I mean, one of the ways that he does that is he talks about how the gentleman tends to turn morality into aesthetics. He talks about how there's a certain self-respect involved in that he talks about there's sort of two aspects to the conscience. There's shame and there's fear. And the gentleman tends to get rid of fear entirely, thinking of it as something sort of servile, meaning fear of being judged by the lawmaker, and focus on shame, sort of what is appropriate to his own nature, what is fitting to himself. And his understanding of that is very fascinating, how he talks about the difference between modesty and humility. I suppose maybe a good way to sum it up is the shame and the modesty, those things are sort of self-referential?
Indeed, yes. But they're simply natural virtue, whereas he is really, as compared to, say, supernatural virtue, they go so far, but not far enough. So conscience, as you say, is reduced just to good sense, proprietary, not treading on the toes of other people, but it just doesn't go deeply to what we would call knowing good and evil in the depths of ourselves. And conscience is something there in the background whenever Newman is talking about education.
Right. And of course, conscience is a huge subject for Newman, from what I understand. He talks about how modesty is all about what's on the surface. It is important virtue, but it mainly has to do with what's on the surface, whereas humility deals with what's in the heart. And he makes this really interesting point, which is that a gentleman, or what he calls the religion of reason, it starts with the surface. It works on the surface of man and creates a smooth appearance. And that is why it can somehow seem to work more quickly and effectively than the Christian faith on people, because the Christian faith, as he says, the church starts with the heart. And with most people, it may never even work its way to the surface, but it's dealing with what is most important.
Yes, no, I totally agree with that. Yes, that's precisely what he does say, yes, that a natural education just deals with the surface of things, whereas the church can dig down into the depths of the person and into the heart itself.
How would he propose that intellectual culture be baptized? Because he talks about the necessity for this, but he's sort of vague in general about it at the end of this work.
Yes, it's getting the balance between faith and reason right. But he wants Christians to apply their minds, not be afraid to use them, and to be open to all truth. Because truth cannot contradict truth. The truth of science, the truth of economics, the truth of mathematics, none of that can contradict Christian truth. So he's fearless as regards dealing with knowledge of any type whatsoever. One of the dangers, of course, though, of the natural man is that he will become big-headed. And I think this is probably a failing, a weakness of all intellectuals, of all academics, which is all the more reason to have the virtue of humility, to put ourselves and what we know into perspective, and also just to approach knowledge itself from the point of view of exploring what God has created. There's somehow a disposition there of just wonder, of seeing what is around us, which Newman is quite keen on.
Which is a great way to bring together, the best that is at the roots of natural philosophy. And insofar as even in the classical idea of philosophy, it's supposed to begin with wonder. So it begins with this great promise, and that promise often is not borne out, in the results, in the formation of human souls. But that promise is there. So the idea that you've put there as far as the way that we can practice the intellectual lives in a faithful way, that confirms and validates, but also brings to its proper fruition this classical idea of philosophy beginning with wonder.
Yes, quite. I quite agree with you, yeah.
So what are some of the things you mentioned, some of these other works he wrote, and also letters and things like that? What did he say about education elsewhere that he didn't say in the idea of an education that he considered to be very important?
There's an awful lot, especially on the pastoral side. So, for example, he gives it a phrase, genius loci. It's the ambience, the atmosphere, the tradition of a place. And he says that's a key player in education, sometimes more powerful than the common room, the faculty, passed down from one generation to the next. So arranging your university, ensuring that this is there and it's thriving, flourishing, is something, yes, which affects everyone. He talks about mutual education, informal education. So he says he mentions it once in the idea, whenever two people sit down to eat together, they talk, one talks, one listens, they're adjusting viewpoints, they're interacting, they're judging. So there's a lecture going on from one to the other. So Newman is sort of attuned to the fact that education doesn't just take place in very formal settings, but in informal ones, or semi-formal ones for that matter as well. Sports teams, music, drama. He's also very open to the idea of personal influence. I mean, hence that motto he picked, cor ad cor loquitur. The idea that it's a phrase which enters his writings a lot. Mind acting on mind, intellect on intellect, heart on heart. He sees, yes, how it's the whole person of a lecturer or academic can affect a student in more ways than just passing on knowledge. He talks a lot about the formation of character elsewhere and sees the role of the tutor in particular as the one which, and he has this phrase, the making of men. So this training of virtue he sees outside the lecture hall, laboratory, library taking place in collegiate homes. So lots of these ideas are very suggestive, inspirational, practical, and in many ways they whether you're reading the idea or his other writings, I always think they're not dry, they're heavy going, but they're very inspirational. And it's a bit like encouraging someone to go and climb a mountain. They've got to there's a lot of hard work getting all the equipment, but it's wonderfully breathtaking when you go up and see the wonderful views there. It's well worthwhile. And somehow that is what Newman's, it's a thrilling sort of encounter, really. And a lot of young people, I think, today, it's just the next thing you do in life, go to university. And if only they would read something like the idea, then they would, I think, be charmed on the one hand, but inspired on another to ascend these academic heights and to see the views you get when you reach the top. Views of your own subject, but also all the other surrounding subjects. He mixes up his metaphors endlessly. He even talks at one stage.
But you're right. He does talk about the need to be able to stand above your knowledge so as not to be crushed by it.
Yes, indeed. Yes, that's right. Yeah. But he also speaks about how even major cities somehow have, because you might think he writes up the university in such a perfect fashion that no institution on the planet could possibly attain that level of being. But on the other hand, he then says every major city has aspects of a university about it in a very sort of unstructured fashion. People are learning there, whether it's courts of law or in buildings to do with government. There are systems being passed down, traditions. So it's a very elastic idea he has as well. So if he were around today, I'm sure he'd identify aspects of our university, whatever type it was, which he would say fulfills. There's a living university there, but he'd also be able to point out ways in which it fails to live up to this fantastic notion and vision that he has.
Now, of course, he was putting these ideas into practice with institutions like the Catholic University in Ireland. Mm-hmm. What does that sort of add to our picture that he gives us in the idea of a university in terms of how he actually applied these things?
Well, I think it's in one of the early essays, these 20 historical essays I've spoken about a couple of times. He actually says that sometimes when you want the best which is going, you've got to undo your principles and do precisely the opposite to what you had in theory intended to do. So he was, obviously you've got to have your principles, you've got to have them stacked up in order, what are the most important things, but you've also got to be able to sort of work with the material coming in, with the people you have as academics, with the situation in the country. And he was asked to found a university, really, which was impossible to make work, coming a few years after a famine, which had seen millions die or emigrate. The country was bankrupt. There's been no Catholic university there ever. People didn't know what one was, really. They had no help from the British government. They were unwilling to offer them a charter or any money. So in one sense, it didn't work out well. It was a failure, but that doesn't mean that what he did isn't worthy of imitation. I would argue quite the contrary. It was an impossible situation for anyone to do. So to see how he set it up, how he tried to get a tutorial system going, copying the Oxford model, which to some extent he had started himself, how he wanted collegiate houses working, and how he was actually very willing to set up science faculties. The most successful part of his university was, in fact, the medical school. So when it was finally merged into the National University of Ireland, the medical part was the biggest medical faculty in Ireland. He tried to set up chemistry, physics labs, sent off people to Germany to buy out libraries. He wanted to exploit the minerals and other resources of Ireland. So he was very down to earth. He tried to balance that out, obviously, with giving liberal education as far as was possible. But he was prepared to roll up his sleeves and to do as much as he can and to bring down his highfalutin ideas to the level at which people were at. Because obviously the school system there wasn't quite what it was elsewhere.
It sounds like he was very much amenable to bringing in sort of the modern sciences and not just the traditional liberal arts.
Yes. He'd been told by Archbishop Paul Cullen that this is what the Pope in fact wanted. The Pope was worried that Catholic universities weren't engaging in science. And Newman put his full weight behind that. And he set up a an academic magazine in which all the scientists could publish their works. And when the British Institution of Science met in Dublin, he sent people out to go there and give papers, invited them round to the Catholic University. He talked to each of the scientists. He'd done some science in Oxford himself. He'd been to chemistry lectures. Geology was just beginning. He'd read up on physics experiments, and astronomy and mathematics. So he was interested in every discipline, and he entered into them to the extent that he could do, and encouraged the academics, even if they hadn't got pupils, which they hadn't initially, to work at their subject, to try and publish if they could. And certainly, engineering, I should mention, of course, was one in particular that he pushed and did start, because that was one of the ways of getting into the British forces, was by the engineering qualification.
If you don't mind, I have one more question that isn't directly about Newman, but bears on some of these ideas. At the same time I was reading The Idea of a University, I also read Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, and I read Dorothy Sayers' essays, The Lost Tools of Learning, about the liberal arts. And it was interesting to see them sort of echoing a lot of the same things that Newman had said. And I have no doubt that they read Newman's Idea of a University, of course. But one thing that Dorothy Sayers said struck me, which is the danger of giving people a little education and then no more. Specifically, she talks about how if you've taught people to read and not how to discern, how to make proper judgments and to judge what they read, one thing you've done essentially is opened them to a vast field of propaganda that you've made them vulnerable to without giving them the proper defenses. And this sort of makes me wonder about who should have a liberal education, because Sayers is talking about this mainly about the trivium, and she's talking about things that she believes can be accomplished mainly at the primary and secondary school level. She's not even talking about universities, but especially because at least in the United States, our primary and secondary schools are so poor that the universities are hardly even doing what should have been accomplished in the secondary schools. I guess I'm sort of rambling on here, but I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are, and also how you think Newman would have addressed this problem of who ought to have a liberal education. Should everybody who can read have some degree of a liberal education?
Yes, everyone, I think. Yes, Newman wrote and said a huge amount about all the things that you've just mentioned. He thought it was dangerous. It does seem strange when you read that he advised people not to indulge their curiosity in just reading novels endlessly. He pulled up students on this, in fact, and encouraged them instead to concentrate on few things, but to actually focus on the arguments in the book, if it was a novel. So this is where his idea of not just absorbing facts, but actually systematizing them, processing them, assimilating them comes in. So he was very, very, very strong on, yes, the mind being formed in order to react to what's put in front of it. And this is precisely what he wanted to inculcate both at school level and at university, because after founding the Catholic University, when he came back to England in 1859, he actually founded this, what it was called the Oratory School. And there he put into practice all his ideas at a lower level. What he found in Dublin was he had to produce articles on how to read a book, how to listen to a lecture, how to write a diary, all sorts of basic things for those Irish students who weren't up to the level of the classics, which there were in England, which, like himself, he got down to this level. But I think he would want teachers to put the stress on processing knowledge rather than just amassing knowledge. At the time, I mean, we can think nowadays, Newman wouldn't have much to say about the internet, for example, but precisely in the 1830s and 40s, that was just the moment when cheap popular literature was being churned out in enormous quantities. It's like the pre-internet. It's the equivalent of the internet, effectively. And Newman counters that by talking about the need, yes, to digest information, even at a very elementary level, of putting emphasis there all the time. So it's not just people accumulating knowledge. But at the same time, I think it's got to be said that a lot of people, I mean, he does say this, there are many people who don't go to university and who end up wiser than those who do. There are plenty of people who just go through the motions and their mind isn't really fully developed, and other people do this never having gone to university. He's not unaware of that. Somehow life educates people and gives them what a university does in a more sophisticated and organized fashion. But we mustn't forget that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, despite growing up in a fairly academic family, I've always been of the mind that not everybody is supposed to, higher education is not for everybody. And, many people would be better off, perhaps even at the high school level, going to a trade school or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, this point made by Dorothy Sayers kind of put some fear into me. It's like, well, yeah, so if we're teaching people to read at all, then we ought to teach them to read well. I mean, I understand that reading is required for many things that are not high intellectual activities. But, how do you find the balance between sort of a full classical education, which I don't think everybody is called to have, and just teaching people to be wise?
I'm not sure quite how to answer that in terms of what Newman would say to it.
Well, what would your view be on it?
Well, I tend to think that in many respects, people aren't ready for a liberal education when they're younger. They're just eager to get on with things. And it's often later on in life that they come back to that. What Newman did offer at the Catholic University, in fact, were evening classes. And that was way before they happened back in England. So he had a whole scheme set up whereby the academics could offer to give lectures in an evening to working people to satisfy their appetite for knowledge, which is very interesting. These were people in their 20s, sometimes 30s, who were coming along to these classes. Newman also found that...
So you're saying not even at what we would call the college age, people weren't necessarily ready always to deal with the classics?
Oh, certainly, yes. Yes, I mean, Newman knew from his own time at Oxford, the classes he was in, of say between 12 and 16 people, you'd have some people that barely literate with Latin and Greek, and just learn a few stock phrases for their elementary exam. Others wouldn't even bother taking the exam. It was just a finishing school, and the exam didn't matter as long as they met the right sort of people. So he'd seen the worst and the best in operation.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the educational problem, and I don't know how it is in Britain, but in the United States, it seems almost intractable because, we could debate what a college should be all we want, but so much just isn't even being done properly at the elementary level, at the high school level. And people discuss all sorts of solutions to this, but, rarely is the fundamental philosophy about what education is really addressed.
Yes, I mean, Newman, interestingly, discourages people from making learning too easy. He does this on all sorts of occasions. And I sometimes wonder whether we ought to just tell people this is hard and not try and water things down too much and let young people sort of rise to the challenge, because I think sometimes we underestimate what they are capable of doing. If people have learned well in the past, they should be capable of learning well now.
Well, I think we probably ought to wrap it up at this point. If you had to recommend one of your books on Newman to people, which one would it be?
Oh, I think it would be The Making of Men, because that's the one which fills out what was said in the idea of university in ways which have not been done before. I spent 9 years working in archives in Dublin and Birmingham, looking at all the foundational documents and piecing together what Newman had achieved, and then looking at the legacy after he'd left and how that was maintained. So it really does give a very different impression of what Newman did. He was not only the rector of the university, he ran one of the student residences himself. He carved Sunday joints for them. He entertained people. He was a tutor. He was a chaplain, confessor. He was he did everything. He turned his hand to employment, entrance exams, setting up a syllabus, dealing with parents, having to sort out disciplinary issues. This is Newman in action. And for me, it's really very important to see that side of him and to balance out all these wonderful things he says in the idea of university which can often be dismissed as being simply impractical. And I like to see practical Newman has got a lot to say to our world.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I may have to pick up a copy of that myself. Just for me, could you recommend a good biography of Newman?
Yes, Ian Carr's is probably still the best. It is quite long. It's 700 pages long, but it's the best of the long ones, yes.
Ian Carr.
Yes, Ian Carr. I mean, he's still alive. He is the number one authority in the world on Newman. I can still picture Cofton Park, September 2010, with Pope Benedict. Up on the altar there was Ian Carr going up at the offertory procession and speaking for a minute or two with Pope Benedict. He'd done more than anyone on the planet. Yes, to develop Newman's thinking, to publish, to bring him to public attention, yes. And I can always remember that.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Paul, for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
For today's reading, I'm just going to give you a good long excerpt from The Idea of a University so you can get a sense of it, and of course of Newman's incredible style. I say then, if we would improve the intellect, first of all we must ascend. We cannot gain real knowledge on a level. We must generalize. We must reduce to method. We must have a grasp of principles, and group and shape our acquisitions by means of them. It matters not whether our field of operation be wide or limited. In every case, to command it is to mount above it. Who has not felt the irritation of mind and impatience created by a deep, rich country visited for the first time, with winding lanes and high hedges and green steeps and tangled woods, and everything smiling indeed, but in a maze? The same feeling comes upon us in a strange city when we have no map of its streets. Hence you hear of practised travelers, when they first come into a place, mounting some high hill or church tower, by way of reconnoitering its neighborhood. In like manner, you must be above your knowledge, not under it, or it will oppress you, and the more you have of it, the greater will be the load. Instances abound. There are authors who are as pointless as they are inexhaustible in their literary resources. They measure knowledge by bulk, as it lies in the rude block, without symmetry, without design. How many commentators are there on the classics? How many on Holy Scripture, from whom we rise up, wondering at the learning which has passed before us, and wondering why it passed? How many writers are there of ecclesiastical history, such as Mosheim or Dupin, who, breaking up their subject into details, destroy its life, and defraud us of the whole by their anxiety about the parts? I'll skip a bit ahead here. Such readers are only possessed by their knowledge, not possessed of it. Nay, in matter of fact, they are often even carried away by it, without any volition of their own. Recollect, the memory can tyrannize, as well as the imagination. Derangement, I believe, has been considered as a loss of control over the sequence of ideas. The mind, once set in motion, is henceforth deprived of the power of initiation, and becomes the victim of a train of associations, one thought suggesting another, in the way of cause and effect, as if by a mechanical process or some physical necessity. No one who has had experience of men of studious habits, but must recognize the existence of a parallel phenomenon in the case of those who have overstimulated the memory. In such persons, reason acts almost as feebly and as impotently as in the madman. Once fairly started on any subject whatever, they have no power of self-control. They passively endure the succession of impulses which are evolved out of the original exciting cause. They are passed on from one idea to another and go steadily forward, plodding along one line of thought in spite of the amplest concessions of the hearer, or wandering from it in endless digression in spite of his remonstrances. Now, if, as is very certain, no one would envy the madman the glow and originality of his conceptions, why must we extol the cultivation of that intellect which is the prey, not indeed of barren fancies, but of barren facts, of random intrusions from without, though not of morbid imaginations from within? And in thus speaking, I am not denying that a strong and ready memory is in itself a real treasure. I am not disparaging a well-stored mind, though it be nothing besides, provided it be sober, any more than I would despise a bookseller's shop. It is of great value to others, even when not so to the owner. Nor am I banishing, far from it, the possessors of deep and multifarious learning from my ideal university. They adorn it in the eyes of men. I do but say that they constitute no type of the results at which it aims, that it is no great gain to the intellect to have enlarged the memory at the expense of faculties which are indisputably higher. Nor indeed am I supposing that there is any great danger, at least in this day, of overeducation. The danger is on the other side. I will tell you, gentlemen, what has been the practical error of the last 20 years. Not to load the memory of the student with a mass of undigested knowledge, but to force upon him so much that he has rejected all. It has been the error of distracting and enfeebling the mind by an unmeaning profusion of subjects, of implying that a smattering in a dozen branches of study is not shallowness, which it really is, but enlargement, which it is not, of considering an acquaintance with the learned names of things and persons, and the possession of clever duodecimos, and attendance on eloquent lecturers, and membership with scientific institutions, and the sight of the experiments of a platform and the specimens of a museum, that all this was not dissipation of mind, but progress. All things now are to be learned at once, not first one thing, then another, not one well, but many badly. Learning is to be without exertion, without attention, without toil, without grounding, without advance, without finishing. There is to be nothing individual in it, and this, forsooth, is the wonder of the age. What the steam engine does with matter, the printing press is to do with mind. It is to act mechanically, and the population is to be passively, almost unconsciously enlightened by the mere multiplication and dissemination of volumes. Whether it be the school boy or the school girl, or the youth at college, or the mechanic in the town, or the politician in the Senate, all have been the victims in one way or other of this most preposterous and pernicious of delusions. Wise men have lifted up their voices in vain, and at length, lest their own institutions should be outshone, and should disappear in the folly of the hour, they have been obliged, as far as they could with a good conscience, to humor a spirit which they could not withstand, and make temporizing concessions at which they could not but inwardly smile. It must not be supposed that, because I so speak, therefore I have some sort of fear of the education of the people. On the contrary, the more education they have, the better, so that it is really education. Nor am I an enemy to the cheap publication of scientific and literary works, which is now in vogue. On the contrary, I consider it a great advantage, convenience, and gain, that is, to those whom education has given a capacity for using them. Further, I consider such innocent recreations as science and literature are able to furnish will be a very fit occupation of the thoughts and the leisure of young persons, and may be made the means of keeping them from bad employments and bad companions. Moreover, as to that superficial acquaintance with chemistry and geology and astronomy and political economy and modern history and biography and other branches of knowledge, which periodical literature and occasional lectures and scientific institutions diffuse throughout the community, I think it a graceful accomplishment, and a suitable, nay, in this day a necessary accomplishment, in the case of educated men. Nor, lastly, am I disparaging or discouraging the thorough acquisition of any one of these studies, or denying that, as far as it goes, such thorough acquisition is a real education of the mind. All I say is, call things by their right names, and do not confuse together ideas which are essentially different. A thorough knowledge of one science and a superficial acquaintance with many are not the same thing. A smattering of 100 things or a memory for detail is not a philosophical or comprehensive view. Recreations are not education. Accomplishments are not education. Do not say, the people must be educated, when, after all, you only mean amused, refreshed, soothed, put into good spirits and good humor, or kept from vicious excesses. I do not say that such amusement, such occupations of mind are not a great gain, but they are not education. You may as well call drawing and fencing education as a general knowledge of botany or conchology. Stuffing birds or playing stringed instruments is an elegant pastime and a resource to the idle, but it is not education. It does not form or cultivate the intellect. Education is a high word. It is the preparation for knowledge, and it is the imparting of knowledge in proportion to that preparation. We require intellectual eyes to know withal, as bodily eyes for sight. We need both objects and organs intellectual. We cannot gain them without setting about it. We cannot gain them in our sleep or by haphazard. The best telescope does not dispense with eyes. The printing press or the lecture room will assist us greatly, but we must be true to ourselves. We must be parties in the work. A university is, according to the usual designation, an alma mater, knowing her children one by one, not a foundry or a mint or a treadmill.